We begin today's shiur 11 lines from the bottom of Daf Mem Ches Omid Aleph. Before we begin the actual Gemara, we glance at the side where we have a topic heading, Nosei Klali. This represents a general topic heading that we've called Yefas Toar. This refers to a captive woman taken under war circumstances by the Jewish army. A soldier captured a Gentile woman in battle. The Torah, recognizing that people have certain inclinations called Yetzer Hara, and that at times it's very difficult to overcome these impulses, and as a result there's a certain allowance that even though marriage between Jew and Gentile is strictly forbidden, under war circumstances the military atmosphere is such that it's very difficult to control these impulses. So the Torah has an allowance for how to deal with a Jewish soldier that is drawn to a Gentile woman that he takes captive. So the Torah prescribes different stages in how to deal with it, and we will see some of those points mentioned in the Gemara. As we go on in the Gemara, we will also take note of the Nosei, the topic heading, where we will see a machlokes Rebbe Elazar of Rabbi Akiva of the Firush HaPasuk, a controversy, an argument between Rebbe Elazar and Rabbi Akiva how to explain the pasuk which says V'gilcha es roisha v'yasa es siparneha. What does the word v'yasa es siparneha mean? In addition to the Torah's requirement of an initial shaving of her head, she also has to do something with her fingernails. Rabbi Elazar says takutz, that v'yasa means she cuts them off. She trims her fingernails or cuts the fingernails. And Rabbi Akiva says tagdil, that she is to have them grow long. There's another pasuk that will be the focus of their discussion. She cries, mourns over her mother and father. Rabbi Elazar says mamish, that refers literally to her mother and father. And Rabbi Akiva says that refers to idolatry, that she cries over her need to depart, to leave, to abandon her idolatrous ways. The Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, V'gilcha es roisha, v'asasa es tziporneha. Rabbi Elazar Omer takutz, that the word v'asasa, in the context of her fingernails, it means she cuts her fingernails. Rabbi Akiva Omer tagdil. Rabbi Akiva says she must grow them long. Omer Rabbi Eliezer, Nemro asiya b'roish v'nemro asiya b'tzipornayim. We see the word asiya in the case of her head. The pasuk said v'gilcha es rosha. That's an action of doing. She shaves her head, and we find asiya an action as referring to her fingernails. Ma lahalon ha'abora. Just like by the head, it has to do with the removal of that which was growing on it, namely removal of the hair. Afkan, so too with the tzipornayim, with the fingernails, ha'avora, a cutting of the fingernails. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ne'amar asiya barosh, v'ne'amar asiya b'tzipornayim. In both, you see the term asiya, or more accurately, you see action, because you don't find the word asiya by head, you see v'gilcha, but it has to do with an action. Ma lahalon nivol, just like by the head, it involves the shaving off of her hair, which is a form of making her undesirable. Nivol is disgusting. Afkan nivol, so too with regard to the fingernails, contrary to maybe contemporary thoughts about cosmetics and beauty, long fingernails are considered ugly. So therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, just like it's not so much the action per se that is emphasized, but according to Rabbi Akiva, it's more the result that is of interest. V'raya l'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, a proof to Rabbi Eliezer's approach that asiya is a reference to removal of, has to do with cutting, clipping, and shaving. We have a pasuk. It says, "U'Mephibosheth ben Shaul yorad likras hamelech loi asa raglov ve'loi asa svamoy." My asiya. What is the word asiya in this case? The pasuk describes the son of Shaul, Mephibosheth, who went to greet King David, and it describes him in a disheveled state. And as the pasuk says, he didn't asa raglov. That means he didn't cut his toenails, and he didn't shave his mustaches, the hair growing on his face. So that we see the word asiya means he didn't remove that which was growing. And that is what Rabbi Eliezer said, that asiya, when you see the word v'asta, it means removal. Tonu Rabbana. We continue with another Tanaic source, and the Yefas Toar, the beautiful woman that was taken captive in battle, that the Jewish soldier wants to take as a mate. We continue at the top of Amid Beis. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Aviyah means Aviyah Mamish, that she spends a period of time after he took her in battle, crying over her father, and Ima equals Ima Mamish, her mother. She's now being removed from, taken away from her family. So the pasuk refers to her crying over that loss. Rabbi Kiva Omer Aviyah v'Ima. These words, Zu Avodas Kechavan, they are references to idolatry. You might want to note before we go too much further, the pasuk that we're referring to is in Dvarim, Perek Chof Aleph pasuk Yud Gimel. On the side, we've written the quote, Uvachsa Esaviv Sima Yerach Yamim. She cries over her mother and father for a period of a Yerach is a month, Yamim. Ve'achar Kain Tavo Yoleo V'alta V'hosil Chalisha. And after that period lapses, he has intimacy with her, and she becomes this soldier's wife. Rabbi Kiva told us that the crying expressed in the pasuk is over the loss of her idols. V'cheinu Omer. The Gemara continues, third line from the top, and thusly it says in the pasuk, Omrim la'etz avi ata ule'even at yilidosoi. The pasuk describes idolaters as saying to the wood, "You are my father," and to the stone, that you bore me. The pasuk says, in the case of the Yefas Toar, Yerach Yomim. Yerach equals Shloshim Yoim. 30-day period where the soldier waits until he takes her as a wife. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer Tish'im Yom. He sees in this pasuk 90 days. Yerach equals Shloshim, Yomim equals Shloshim, the Achar Kain equals another Shloshim, so 3 times Shloshim is 30, 3 times 30, 90 days. Maskif lo Ravina challenges that calculation. He says, Emo Yerach equals Shloshim, Yomim equals Shloshim. You can say that Yerach Yomim, that will account for 60 days. The Achar Kain, that expression is Kihani, another same amount, another 60 days, which would be a total of 120 days. Kashya, the Gemara leaves this as a point of difficulty regarding the Tanaic source, why it concluded specifically 90 days when 120 days could have also been concluded as the waiting period between his capturing her and taking her as a wife. Before we continue in the Gemara, we notice at the side a topic heading, which reads, Machlekes Tanoim im muter lekayim avodim she'enam molin. Is it permissible to maintain a slave that refuses to circumcise himself? In addition to children being born into Jewish families, male children at 8 days, there is the Torah requirement of a bris milah, circumcision. There is also an expectation that slaves that a person buys also are to be circumcised. What we're dealing with now is the issue of a slave that doesn't cooperate. Can you keep him? Can you maintain ownership of such an individual? Rabbi Shmuel, we will see, is matir, and Rabbi Kiva is restrictive. He is Oser. Now the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan. Mekaymen Avodim She'enom Molim. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael allows one to maintain possession of a slave that doesn't circumcise himself. Rabbi Kiva Omer Ein Mekaymen. You're not allowed to keep them. Omar lei Rabbi Yishmael. Hareyu Omer V'nafesh ben Amosecha. This is a pasuk from Shmois Perchav Gimel pasuk Yud Beis. We've quoted the pasuk on the side of the Gemara, so let's take a look at it together. It says, we've written on the side of the Gemara, Sheishis Yomim Taseh Masecho. This refers to the observance of Shabbos. So 6 days you work, Uvayom Hashvi Tishbois, and on the 7th day you cease the work, the creative activity. Leman Yonuach Shorecha V'chamorecha V'yinofesh Ben Amosecha V'hager. In order for one's animals and others to rest. We see here that Rabbi Akiva said that you're not allowed to keep an eved that is not mal. Rabbi Yishmael says, but does it not say in the pasuk v'nofesh ben amosecha? And later on the Gemara will prove that this is a reference to an eved orel, an uncircumcised servant, and everyone agrees with that analysis. So what is Rabbi Akiva going to do with this pasuk, which seems to acknowledge one's ownership of an uncircumcised slave? Omar lei, Rabbi Akiva answers, V'lokech eved bein hashmoshesh v'lo ispik l'mulo hakosuv medaber. Lokech means one who purchases, an eved, a slave. Bein hashmoshesh means at the onset of Shabbos. At the moment between, where the transition point between Friday and Shabbos, a person acquired a slave. So he didn't have a chance to circumcise him. You don't circumcise slaves on Shabbos. It's regarding that, and the Torah is telling us that a slave that you purchased that is uncircumcised, nevertheless he is not to do work for you on that very Shabbos. The Kuli Almonias, everyone, however, does agree, V'nofesh ben Amosecha be'eved orel ksiv. The pasuk is referring to an uncircumcised slave. My mashma, how do you see that in the words? How does the Gemara know to conclude that V'nofesh ben Amosecha is referring to an uncircumcised slave? The Sanya. So we present another Tanaic source. V'nofesh ben Amosecha be'eved orel hakosuv medaber. This pasuk is talking about an orel, uncircumcised slave. Ata oimer be'eved orel o eino elo be'eved mahul. You're saying that it means uncircumcised. Well, maybe it means mahul, circumcised. Kishu omer, where the pasuk says leman yonuach avdecha v'amoscha kamoicha. So here you have another pasuk referring to slaves. Harei eved mahul amor. That pasuk refers to the need for non-activity on the part of regular circumcised slaves. So then what am I going to do with this phrase from this other pasuk that says that the ben amosecha, that the servant must remain inactive, no work, no constructive activity on Shabbos? It's talking about that other kind of slave, an uncircumcised slave. V'hager ze ger toishav. In the pasuk of Shmos Chav Gimel pasuk Yud Beis, you saw a reference to the ger. Now, the ger in this case is not a reference to a convert, but it's a reference to a ger toshav. This is a Gentile that accepts the 7 Noahide laws because God commanded. Thusly, he is considered a ger toshav, and the Torah has certain provisions for such an individual. He's a Gentile that lives amongst the Jews, even in the land of Israel. He's a ger toshav because he accepted upon himself the Sheva Mitzvos B'nei, the 7 Noahide laws. He is entitled to dwell amongst the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Ata oimer ze ger toshav. You're saying it means that kind of sojourner. Oy eino elo ger tzedek. Maybe it is a reference to a convert. Kishomer, when the pasuk says elsewhere v'gercha asher bisharecha in the 10 Commandments, so harei ger tzedek amur. There, the Torah refers to the need of the convert, the righteous convert, to cease from all constructive activities on Shabbos. So then what am I going to do with this other pasuk from Shmos Chav Gimel pasuk Yud Beis? Ze ger toshav. That's a reference to a ger toshav, that he cannot do constructive activity for Jews on Shabbos. For himself, that's not one of Sabbath observance is not one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Ben Enoch. In fact, he's forbidden in observing Shabbos. But the pasuk that warns against the ger, the sojourner, doing malacha, that would be doing malacha for Jews. But before we continue in the Gemara, we have a nosei mivneh, a topic heading with a structural note. You can see on the side of the Gemara a triangle is featured. Divrei Amoraim, these are Amoraic statements that are highlighted with Shimon Levi and later Rebbe Eloi. Shemitaren mitzius shel eved orel eitzel Yisrael. It describes the situation of an uncircumcised slave by a Jew. HaGemara Tavarer im Dvorim elu yichilu liyos kafi Rabbi Akiva. Can these statements comply with Rabbi Akiva's approach? We saw not long ago, just before, Rabbi Akiva saying that you cannot be mekayim and eved sheinu mohu. Rabbi Shmuel says you are allowed to. What about these comments made? Can they conform to Rabbi Akiva as well? So now let's see, what did they actually say? Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, halokeach eved min ha'oved kechavim, v'lo yirotza lamul. A Jew purchased a slave from Gentiles, and the slave did not want to be circumcised. Megalgel imoy ad yud beis chodesh. Megalgel means you struggle with him, or you continue with him, you roll with him for 12 months. Lo mol, if he at the end of 12 months doesn't circumcise himself, choser u'moichroi li'ovdei v'chavim. Then you resell him back to Gentiles. Amruha Rabbanon kamei de Rav Papa. Rabbanon, hearing this halacha, this law of Rav Shimon Levi, said it over to Rav Papa, Kiman, and they said, well, based on which Tanaic authority is this? The lo ka Rabbi Akiva. This would not be in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, if this were according to Rabbi Akiva, ha'omar, but didn't Rabbi Akiva say ein mekaymin, that you don't keep such a slave, an uncircumcised slave, even one day? So that Rabbi Shimon Levi would seem to be saying a halacha that conforms only to Rabbi Shmuel and not to Rabbi Akiva. Omar lehu Rav Papa. As we swiggle underline before, 2 lines up, the Amru Rabbanon, what they said to Rav Papa, now we swiggle line Rav Papa's response. Afilu Temo Rabbi Akiva. You can explain Rabbi Shimon Levi's halacha even along the lines of Rabbi Akiva. Hani mili, when is it that Rabbi Akiva says ein mekaymin, that you don't keep them around even for a day? Hecha de lo posko lemilse. That's a case where he was never accepting upon himself to convert. Aval hecha de posko lemilse posko, but where he did accept upon himself the idea of converting, so then that's an acceptance, and that's enough reason to continue keeping him around, even according to Rabbi Akiva. Before we go further, let's just glance at the Rashi. On the upper part of the narrow lines, you'll see there's a Roman numeral number 1. Hani mili de'ein mekayim. When is it that you don't keep him around? According to Rabbi Akiva, he never accepted upon himself conversion. So he never really abandons his gentility, or his gentilehood. But where you buy the slave from the Gentile, and he agrees to convert to slavehood, which, as we've said in previous shurim, involves shmiras mitzvahs, like a Jewish woman has to observe mitzvahs. He has the same mitzvah standard as she does. So where he agreed to that, and which involves also circumcision, the acharka chozer bo, and then he recanted on that. Megalgulin, we roll along with him. Shemo Yachsav Yisrasa, maybe he'll decide once again to convert, and that's the explanation of how the statement made by Rabbi Shimon Levi can conform to Rabbi Akiva. Let's continue in the Gemara. Omar Rav Kahana. Now you'll notice we have a double underline marking. This is designed to highlight the statements made by Rav Kahana you see here, and a few lines later again. So Omar Rav Kahana, Amrisa Lishmaitza Kamed Rav Zvid Menaharda. I said over Rav Papa's explanation to Rav Zvid from the city of Nahar Da'ah. Now, what was the role of Rav Papa? He came to explain how Rabbi Shimon Levi can be in accordance with Rabbi Akiva as well. So now, after Rav Kahana says over Rav Papa's teaching, making a distinction between Posca versus Lo Posca, Omar Li, Rav Zvid said to me, Ihachi, if that's true, Ki Omar Le Rabbi Akiva, when Rabbi Akiva gave an example or an instance of how you can have an Eved Orel. Saw that above where the Pasuk spoke about V'nofesh ben Amosecha, and Rabbi Akiva described that situation, how you can have an Eved Orel. It's where you bought an Eved right at the brink of Shabbos and you didn't have a chance to circumcise him. If Rabbi Akiva would agree with that which Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, so let's read the line of Gemara again. Ihachi ki Omar lei Rabbi Akiva beloikeach Eved bein hashmashos. When Rabbi Akiva used that case as an answer to Rabbi Shmuel, if you need, you have an arrow to the side of the Gemara. You can see where this had appeared earlier. So instead of saying that, Lishmi leha, Rabbi Akiva could have said, if you're asking me, how do you have an Eved Orel in your possession, as the Pasuk indicated, V'nofesh ben Amosecha, well, he could have answered, that's a case where he bought an Eved, he bought a slave, who expressed his interest, his intention of eventually converting, eventually circumcising himself. Even Rabbi Akiva would acknowledge you can have such a slave. So why wasn't this explanation given instead of the case, maybe the rather contrived sounding case of someone buying a slave right at the brink of Shabbos? The Gemara says, really, you're right. The Gemara says, Chado mitrei taimi komar. Above in the Tanakh source where the first arrow appeared, that source was giving only one of two possible answers. How can you have, according to Rabbi Akiva, who doesn't allow you to maintain possession of uncircumcised slaves, how can you have one in your possession? So we saw, one is where he bought the slave right before Shabbos, and the other is a case where he bought a slave from a Gentile, where the slave agreed that somewhere in the near future, he will circumcise himself. So until then, he's an uncircumcised slave that you're allowed to have in your possession. We continue in the Gemara. Sholach Ravin Mishmei Rabbaloi. V'chol Rabboisai Omru Li Mishmo. Ravin sends in the name of Rabbaloi, and he also tells us that all of my teachers told me in his name, in Rabballoi's name, Ezu Eved Orel Shemutu L'Taim. What are the circumstances where you can have an uncircumcised slave that you're allowed to keep? Answer: Zeh Shalok Chai Rabboi Almanas Shaloi Lamulo. This is a slave that you bought with the condition that he would not be circumcised. Amrua Rabbana Kamei Rav Papa. Kiman, this teaching of Rabbaloi, describing your maintaining an uncircumcised slave, a case where you bought him with that condition built in that he will not be circumcised. So they said this to Rav Papa. Kiman, Delo Rabbi Akiva. This statement of Rabbaloi that we had in a triangle does not conform to Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva, Ha'omar Ein Mekaimen. According to Rabbi Akiva, one is not allowed to maintain an uncircumcised slave. He can't maintain him even for one day. Amar Lahu Rav Papa. Rav Papa says back to the Rabbanon that said that Rabbaloi could only be according to Rabbi Shmuel, could not be according to Rabbi Akiva. Rav Papa says to them, Afilu Tamer, Rabbi Akiva, Rabballoi's teaching can conform to Rabbi Akiva. Hani, meaning when is it that we say Ein Mekaimen? When does Rabbi Akiva say Ein Mekaimen? Hecha Delo Asni Bahadei. That's where no condition was stipulated at the outset. Amal Hecha the Asni, but where a condition was stipulated at the outset, that he is being purchased with the condition that he will not be circumcised, even Rabbi Akiva will acknowledge that. Omar Rav Kahana Amrisa L'Shmaitze Kamei the Rav Zvid Min Arda. Similar to what we saw before, Rav Kahana doing, saying over this particular hesber of how Rabbi Loi's comment can conform to Rabbi Akiva. Why before? Again, use the arrows. The arrow, the first of the arrows in the Gemara to the side of the Gemara text, where we saw Rabbi Akiva defending his position that you could have an Eved Orel in your possession where you bought the Eved on the brink of Shabbos. Well, couldn't this explanation also have been given by Rabbi Akiva? That this is the case of the pasuk above, Yinofesh ben Amasecha, is where you bought the slave with a condition that he will not be circumcised. It was an understanding from the outset. So Rav Kana says that I said over Rabbi Loi's teaching to Rav Zvid from Na'arda, and Rav Zvid said, if Rabbi Loi is correct, Ki Kamar le Rabbi Akiva b'loikech eved bein hashmashas v'lo hispik lamulo, when Rabbi Akiva said that to Rabbi Yishmael, that how can we account for an uncircumcised slave in a Jew's possession? It's because he bought him at the brink of Shabbos. Lishni leha. Could Rabbi Akiva have not answered this? That where is it possible to have an Eved Orel in your possession? It's because you bought him with the condition that he would not be circumcised. So this is the question that Rav Zvid puts to Rav Kahana. Why, if what Rabbi Loi said is correct, couldn't Rabbi Akiva have given this case of Asni? They made it tonight. V'litamech lishni lehach. And according to you who are asking on Rabbi Loi from this, Rabbi Akiva not have answered the answer that we gave before of Pascha, namely where the Eved agreed at the time he was bought, he had agreed to convert with the circumcision. So that answer would have been good as well. Ela chad mitrei utlas taimi komar. Above in the Tanaic source, where Rabbi Yishmael had challenged Rabbi Akiva answered. He simply answered one of three possible answers. The one answer that he did give was that Bein Hashmoshes answer, buying the slave from the Gentile on the brink of Shabbos, where there wasn't any chance to circumcise him because of the onset of Shabbos. He could have given the answer of Pascha or the answer of Asni as well. Yosef, Rabbi Chanina bar Popi, Rav Ami, Rabbi Yitzchok Nafcha, Akilud, Rabbi Yitzchok Nafcha, V'yasvi v'ko'amri. So you have three Rabbanim that were sitting at the entrance of Rabbi Yitzchok's house. Ir achas hoisa beretz Yisrael. It was a city in the land of Israel. The servants, the slaves in that city, did not want to circumcise themselves. And they continued with them. The owners continued holding on to these slaves for 12 months. And after the 12 months, the Jewish owners, seeing that the slaves did not circumcise, they sold them back to the idol worshippers. Kiman. This teaching is in accordance with whom? Ki hai Tana Tisanu. It would be in accordance with the Tana that we see in the following source. Person buys a slave from idol worshippers, and the slave doesn't want to circumcise himself. You roll along with him in time until 12 months. If he doesn't circumcise himself at that point, sell him back to the idol worshippers. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Ein Mashin Oisei Beretz Yisrael, V'nei Hefsid Taras. We don't keep him in the land of Israel, being that he refused to circumcise himself. He basically maintains a Gentile status, and as such, he would be metame the trumos in the land, like is the din regarding a goy. And in a border city, you don't keep around an uncircumcised slave for any amount of time. Why? Shema Yishama Davar. He might pick up on, let's say, Jewish secrets, and V'yelech V'yomar L'chavero V'yikov, will go to his friend, the idol worshipper, across the border. So in order to preserve national security, slaves that refuse to circumcise themselves, we don't keep them even for a moment. Once again, because they might compromise issues of security. Tanya, Rabbi Hananya b'noi Rabbi Gamliel Oimer, Mipnei ma gerim bizman hazeh meunin v'yisurin boyin aleim. Why is it that converts nowadays seem to be suffering and oppressed? You see diamonds that appear in the source, and on the side under the same Mivneh heading, these diamonds answer the question of Mipnei ma yisurin boyin al gerim bizman hazeh. Why do gerim seem to suffer nowadays? So the first answer, Mipnei shelo kaimu sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, that before their conversion, as Gentiles, they did not observe the 7 Noahide laws. Up till now, the Almighty did not punish them. But now that he converts, so he is held accountable and is punished in this world, so that he will benefit greatly in the world to come. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi disagrees with the Tanakama, with Rabbi Hananya ben Rabbi Gamliel, because Geir Shinizgayer, someone who converts, Kikoton Shenoilad Dom, he's like a child born. He has no connection with the past. He's one person as a Gentile, and upon converting, he becomes like a newborn. So that how can you explain the Yisurin on Gerim based on something that he did when he was another person, when he was a Gentile? Ella mipnei ma meunin. So according to Rabbi Yossi, why are Gerim the victims of oppression? Lafi she'ein bekiin b'dikdukei mitzvahs, because they're not diligent in fulfilling the details of mitzvahs. Abba Chonon Omer Mishum Rebbe Lozer. Abba Chonon in the name of Rebbe Lozer says, Lafi she'ein oisin me'avo el miyira. Their worshipping of God is not out of love, but it's out of fear of punishment, retribution, fear of being in Gehenna. So because that's their level of observance, which is, we'd say, in a manner of speaking, a lower level of adherence, of observance of mitzvahs, one would work with the assumption that doing or observing the mitzvahs, practicing your Judaism out of love, is considered a more worthy type of existence. But the Gerim practice their Judaism because of fear of purgatory. So as a result of that, it's a lower level form of a Jewish observance, Jewish practice, so they're subject to the Yisurin that were mentioned. Very interesting answer. Why do they receive punishment and retribution? Why do Gerim experience that? Because they delayed in coming into the fold, literally under the wings of the divine presence. So because of this delay, they are being punished. Omar Rabbi Yehonasan Berger, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yehonasan, some versions have Rabbi Chanina saying, "My kraw." What's the pasuk that indicates this point? So pasuk is from Ruth, from the book of Ruth. Yeshalem Hashem Polech Vatim Eskurtech Shlema Meim Hashem Elokei Yisrael Asher Bos Lachsot. So Ruth is receiving a blessing that she had full reward because she came to dwell amongst the Jews and accept Judaism. And the expression at the end of this pasuk was Bos Lachsois, and the Rashi says Shemihart Velo Ichart, that you hastened in coming. So that you see the non-hastening is considered a negative circumstance, and reason enough for, as the source says, Me'unin V'Surim. The last word, V'gomer, means as far as the pasuk itself has a continuation to it.